Why is there so much variety of life on Earth? Why are we who we are? The answer is evolution. Charles Darwin's exploration of the theory of evolution had been known as the greatest discovery in the scientific world, creating new exchanges of ideas and reactions, and including the many encounters of new ideas and challenging theories about who we are, about the species, and most importantly, about how we all became to be. The exploration, encounter, and exchange of evolution, the key to unlocking the origin of species, by Anish Mupidi. Through the formation of his theory, Darwin was able to explain the diversity and complexity of life. He revolutionized the way the world knew life itself, by causing people to question their very own existence. However, his theory was met by fierce opposition by religious groups and the exchange of controversy. Charles Darwin was born in 1809, February 12th, in Shrewsbury, England. He is the son of Robert Waring Darwin and Susanna Darwin.
Charles Darwin was someone who was incredibly good at observing nature. He was a true naturalist.
Darwin then admits in the University of Cambridge and stays there for 2 terms. Then, in August, Charles Darwin returned to Shrewsbury to find a letter from Professor Henslow inviting him to join the Beagle voyage. He then meets with Captain Robert Fitzroy to make preparations for the voyage, and begins the Beagle Diary, which was an account for his worldwide journey. As stated in his diary, Darwin had little ambitions for groundbreaking scientific research. However, after surveying the coast of South America, the HMS Beagle departed in the Galapagos Islands. This was his opportunity for his first exploration of what will become his life's research. During his visit to the islands, Darwin had noted in his diary that unique creatures were similar from island to island, but perfectly adapted to their environments, which led him to ponder the origin of the island's inhabitants. After exploring the geographical islands of the Galapagos, Darwin continued his trip to other variously formed islands. Through his trip on the HMS Beagle, he was able to explore and investigate the process of natural selection.
Natural selection is when you have different individuals in a population surviving at different rates.
When he had returned to England, he had become famous for his work in the scientific community, but would eventually become infamous to the religious groups all over the world. At this time, other research and works were being published by geologists that questioned the biblical story of the creation of the world made by God. However, this was taken lightly by the Christian community. Knowing that religious groups and people will have a hard time accepting his theory, Darwin had difficulty trying to publish his work. When doing so, he had said in his diary, "Here then, at last got a theory by which to work, but I was so anxious to avoid prejudice that I determined not for some time to even write the briefest sketch of it." But courageously, Darwin had published his works on the theory of evolution in 1859 in his book, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. With his new theory on natural selection, new openings in the scientific community had appeared. Scientists all over the world had carefully considered his theory, and in a result, his theory had encountered more ideas to support the evidence of evolution itself, and changed history as we know it. Among these encounters, a well-known scientist in Australia by the name of Alfred Wallace had encountered evidence that species had adapted depending on their environments. In other words, natural selection. Later that year, he wrote to the well-known Darwin. Darwin responded back in the following documents. It is curious how we hit on the same ideas. Darwin had admired Wallace's work, and they had jointly published the theory of evolution by the means of natural selection together. Adding to these new ideas that were formed, a well-known popular geologist, Charles Lyell, used Darwin's theory to encounter a rather unintentional discovery of fossils from prehistoric events. These fossils were similar but had small changes differing from each region. This evidence had supported Darwin's theory, but also aggravated the religious communities. Later, after 6 months, a successful botanist, Joseph Hooker, had used Darwin's theory to put his research under the investigation that plant life is also affected by evolution. He was among the first to demonstrate the application and importance of the evolutionary theory to botany. And with these new groundbreaking research, the scientific growth of the theory of evolution by the means of natural selection had encountered more openings and was being progressively accepted. However, with the growth in evolution in the scientific communities, the exchange of reactions between the religious communities and scientific communities was a result between major controversy and opposition.
A very controversial and just profoundly controversial and just problematic new theory that people would object to based on religious ground.
Followed by the public controversy, on June 30th, 1860, the famous opponent of evolution, Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, debated the evolutionary theory with the evolutionist Thomas Huxley. Samuel Wilberforce, the Anglican Archbishop of Oxford and one of the most highly respected religious leaders in the 19th century England, condemned natural selection in a famous speech on what he deemed the theory's scientific deficiencies at the 1860 meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. At one point during the meeting, Wilberforce reportedly asked the biologist Thomas Henry Huxley whether he was related to an ape on his grandmother's or grandfather's side. Huxley, whose vigorous defense of the evolutionary theory had earned him the nickname Darwin's Bulldog, allegedly replied that he would be rather an ancestor of a monkey than an advanced and intelligent human being who employed his knowledge and eloquence in misrepresenting those who were wearing out their lives in the search for truth. The debate became famous as the symbol of clashes between evolutionists and creationists. As Wilberforce had said, man's derived supremacy over the earth, man's power of articulate speech, man's gift of reason, man's free will and responsibility are all equally and utterly irreconcilable with the degrading notion of the brute origin of him who is created in the image of God. This excerpt from the debate expressed the opinion of creationists of their reaction to Darwin's work. Recently after this debate, England's highest-ranking Catholic official, Henry Cardinal Manning, denounced Darwin's views as a brute philosophy to wit, there is no God and the ape is our Adam. A huge event in history that shaped the forces of evolution was the Scopes trial, commonly referred to as the Scopes evolution trial or the Scopes monkey trial, which began on July 10, 1925. The defendant, John Thomas Scopes, was a high school teacher who had been charged by violating the Butler Act by teaching the theory of evolution in his classes. As stated in the New York Times article July 21st report, the Butler Act forbid the teaching of any theory that denied the biblical story of creationism. By teaching that man had descended from ape, Scopes had violated the Butler Act and was arrested. At the ensuing trial, William Jennings Bryan was invited as a special prosecutor, and the world-famous criminal defense lawyer Clarence Darrow defended Scopes. The trial raged on for days, but the judge did not allow any of Darrow's scientists to testify his reasons. Bryan portrayed Darrow as an agnostic and atheist. In desperation, Darrow even put Bryan himself on stand. And Darrow was brilliantly able to get Bryan to admit that the world of the Bible is not literal, and it was interpreted. This seemed to destroy the whole case. Darrow asked for immediate judgment, and when the jury came back, Darrow was shocked. He had lost. The judge levied the minimum fine possible, $100, against Scopes. Later that year, the Scopes conviction was overturned on a technicality. However, the case displayed the vast differences between the big cities and small towns, about their view on evolution. The newspapers such as the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post covering the trial scoffed at the Butler Law as ignorant and archaic. They saw Scopes as a hero. The Southern and Midwest newspapers, such as the Crossville Chronicles, the Chicago Sentinel, and the Indiana Sentinel, saw Scopes as a criminal. The world had to make a decision. Will we move on to a more scientific approach or a more religious movement? However, only time could tell. Now our modern culture has softened the conflict and weaved most views as one. However, still to this day, some states and educators are battling whether to teach the evolutionary theory in schools. Similar cases to the Scopes trial still occur to this day. Nevertheless, Darwin's theory was revolutionary, and it shaped and paved the road for the scientific and religious world we live in. It demonstrated the works of a risk-taker, of a new approach. It demonstrated a new legacy.